At my son's wedding, I sat alone in the back row while strangers took the seats meant for the groom's family. I remember thinking that sentence over and over as the ceremony music played softly through the church, because even now it still doesn't feel real when I say it out loud. My name is Margaret Dawson. I'm 68 years old, and that morning I woke up believing I was about to witness one of the happiest moments of my life. My only son, Daniel, was getting married. I had spent weeks preparing for the day the way mothers do. I pressed my pale blue dress the night before, the one Daniel once said made me look elegant like a movie star from the old days. I polished the small silver brooch my late husband gave me on our 30th anniversary. I even arrived at the church early, nearly 40 minutes before the ceremony, because I wanted to greet guests and make sure everything looked perfect for Daniel. The church itself was beautiful, an old stone building just outside Denver with tall windows that let the Colorado sunlight spill across the wooden pews. White roses decorated the aisles, and soft music floated through the air as guests began filling the rows. I remember feeling proud as I watched people arrive in their suits and dresses, laughing quietly, holding wedding cards, whispering about how handsome the groom looked. My son, my Daniel. I stood near the entrance for a moment, smoothing the front of my dress, waiting for someone from the wedding party to greet me. Usually the groom's mother is guided to the front rows, the seats reserved for close family. At least, that's what I had seen at every wedding I'd ever attended. But after several minutes passed, no one came. Eventually a young usher approached me with a polite smile and asked if I needed help finding my seat. I told him my name. Margaret Dawson, I said gently. I'm Daniel's mother. The young man blinked for a second, glancing down at the clipboard in his hands. He scanned the page slowly, running his finger across the printed names. I noticed the hesitation in his eyes before he spoke again. Oh, of course, ma'am, he said carefully. Let me show you to your seat. I followed him down the aisle, expecting him to stop somewhere near the front, where the groom's family usually sits. But he kept walking, past the first row, past the second, past the section where Olivia's parents were already seated, smiling proudly as guests greeted them. I felt a small knot form in my stomach as we continued toward the back of the church. Finally, he stopped beside an empty seat in the very last row. Right here, ma'am, he said. I stared at the pew for a moment, certain there had been some kind of mistake. Are you sure? I asked softly. I think I'm supposed to sit with the groom's family. The young usher checked his clipboard again, clearly uncomfortable now. This is the seat assigned to Margaret Dawson, he said. I turned my head slowly and looked toward the front rows. Strangers were sitting there, people I had never seen before. One couple laughed quietly while adjusting their programs. Another guest leaned over to whisper something to a friend. None of them looked like they belonged to Daniel's side of the family. And yet there they were, sitting in the seats meant for us. Meant for me. A few guests nearby glanced in my direction with mild curiosity, probably wondering why an older woman was standing awkwardly in the aisle while everyone else settled into their places. I felt the heat rise in my cheeks, but I forced a small smile and thanked the usher. Then I sat down. From the back row, the altar looked farther away than I expected. I could see Olivia near the front, standing with her bridesmaids, her white dress bright under the sunlight pouring through the tall windows. For a brief moment, her eyes moved across the room and landed on me. She held my gaze for just a second, and then she smiled. Not warmly, not kindly, just a small, controlled smile before she turned back to the wedding planner beside her as if nothing at all was unusual about the groom's mother sitting alone in the last row of the church. The ceremony began a few minutes later, and the soft notes of the piano filled the church as everyone slowly stood to their feet. From where I sat, the back row felt strangely distant from everything that was happening. I watched the guests rise in unison, the gentle rustle of fabric and quiet murmurs blending into the music. The bride's parents stood, proudly in the first row, their shoulders straight, their faces glowing with the kind of pride that usually belongs to both families on a day like this. I remained standing as well, smoothing the front of my dress and trying to convince myself that perhaps there had simply been a mistake. Weddings are complicated events. Seating charts get rearranged. Names get moved. I told myself there must be some explanation. After all, I had been involved in the planning for months. I had sat at the kitchen table with Daniel just 2 weeks earlier, helping him review the final guest list while he drank coffee and laughed about how stressful wedding planning had become. He had looked tired but happy, The same boyish smile I remembered from his childhood still appearing whenever he talked about the future. I had also written several of the checks that helped bring this wedding together. The rehearsal dinner had been my contribution. The florist's deposit had come from my savings. When Daniel and Olivia said the venue needed an additional payment to secure the date, I had quietly handled that as well. None of those things felt like sacrifices to me. They felt like the natural things a mother does when her child reaches an important milestone. I never expected recognition. I only expected to be there beside him. The music shifted as the wedding party began walking down the aisle. One by one the bridesmaids appeared, their dresses flowing softly as they smiled at the crowd. The groomsmen followed with confident steps, adjusting their jackets and nodding politely toward the guests. I watched Daniel take his place at the front beside the officiant. Even from the back of the church I could see how nervous he looked. His hands moved slightly as if he was unsure where to place them. And for a moment I felt the familiar urge to walk up to him, straighten his tie, and tell him everything would be fine. That was something I had done many times when he was younger, before school presentations, before his college graduation, before his first job interview. But today there was a quiet distance between us, measured in rows of wooden pews, and something deeper that I could not yet explain. The guests sat down again, and the church grew quiet as everyone turned toward the doors. The music softened, and Olivia appeared at the end of the aisle on her father's arm. The sunlight from the tall windows caught the lace of her dress and made it glow softly as she began walking forward. The guests smiled warmly, some whispering about how beautiful she looked. I folded my hands in my lap and watched the moment carefully, trying to feel the same simple joy that everyone else seemed to share. Yet even as the ceremony unfolded, a strange awareness lingered in the back of my mind. I noticed small details that did not quite make sense. When the officiant welcomed the guests, he spoke warmly about the union of two families, but he only mentioned Olivia's parents by name. When the photographer moved quietly through the aisle taking pictures, he spent several minutes capturing the smiles of the front rows while the back of the church remained almost invisible. Once or twice I caught people turning their heads slightly in my direction, as if they were trying to understand why the groom's mother was sitting so far away from the altar. Their expressions were not cruel. They were simply puzzled. And each time I noticed those looks, I felt the quiet knot in my chest tighten just a little more. I told myself again that I must be imagining things. Weddings move quickly, and the focus always rests on the couple standing at the front. But then, halfway through the ceremony, something happened that made it impossible to ignore the uneasy feeling growing inside me. As the officiant paused before the next part of the vows, I noticed Olivia lean slightly toward the wedding planner standing near the aisle. They exchanged a few quick words. The planner nodded, glanced briefly toward the back of the church, and then looked away just as quickly. It was such a small moment that most people would not have noticed it at all. But from where I sat, quietly observing everything from a distance, it felt like the first piece of a puzzle slowly sliding into place. For the rest of the ceremony, I tried to focus on Daniel instead of the quiet questions building in my mind. He stood at the altar listening carefully as the officiant spoke about commitment and partnership, occasionally nodding with the same serious expression he used whenever something important was happening. From the back of the church I studied his face the way mothers sometimes do when they realize their children have stepped fully into adulthood. His dark suit fit him perfectly, his hair neatly combed, his posture confident but slightly tense. In that moment, he looked every bit like the man he had become. Yet I could still see flashes of the boy I raised, the child who once ran through our backyard chasing fireflies on warm summer nights, the teenager who stayed up late at the kitchen table asking me questions about college and life and the future. I had always believed that no matter how old Daniel became, there would always be a quiet understanding between us, something steady and unspoken that connected mother and son. But as I watched him that morning, I began to realize how much distance had quietly formed over the past few years. It had not happened all at once. The changes had been small at first, almost easy to ignore. Fewer phone calls, shorter conversations, plans that shifted at the last minute. At the time I told myself it was normal. People grow busy with careers and relationships. Life moves forward. Still, there had been moments when something felt slightly different after Olivia entered Daniel's life. She was always polite when we spoke, always smiling, always careful with her words. But her warmth never seemed entirely genuine. It felt practiced, like someone following instructions rather than speaking from the heart. During family dinners, she often guided the conversations, gently redirecting topics whenever they moved toward Daniel's childhood or our past together. If I mentioned a memory from when Daniel was young, she would laugh softly and say something like, "That must have been a long time ago," before shifting the discussion to something else. At the time, I brushed those moments aside because weddings are meant to unite families, not create tension between them. But sitting there in the back row, watching strangers occupy the places where Daniel's relatives should have been sitting, I began to remember those small conversations more clearly. The officiant continued speaking, explaining the meaning of marriage and the promise two people make when they choose to build a life together. Guests listened attentively, some smiling as they glanced toward the couple at the front. The photographer moved quietly through the side aisle again, capturing images of Olivia's parents holding hands proudly in the front row. I noticed the camera never once turned toward the back where I sat. At one point, Daniel briefly lifted his eyes from the altar and looked across the crowd. For a second, I wondered if he was searching for me. My heart lifted slightly at the thought. But his gaze moved quickly past the back rows without stopping, and within a moment, he turned his attention back to Olivia, standing beside him. The knot in my chest tightened again. Perhaps he had not even realized where I was sitting. Weddings are overwhelming events, full of schedules and expectations and nervous energy. It was possible that he assumed I was somewhere closer to the front. That explanation seemed reasonable enough that I held on to it for several minutes. Then something else caught my attention. As the officiant prepared to begin the vows, I noticed Olivia glance once more toward the aisle where the wedding planner stood. The two women exchanged another quick look. It lasted no longer than a heartbeat, but this time I clearly saw the planner nod in response. Olivia's lips curved into a faint smile before she turned back toward Daniel. I sat very still as that small moment settled in my mind. Until then, I had been telling myself that the seating situation must have been an accident, a simple misunderstanding that would probably be explained later during the reception when everything slowed down and people had time to talk. But the quiet exchange I had just witnessed did not feel accidental at all. It felt deliberate. And for the first time since the ceremony began, a quiet thought entered my mind that I could no longer ignore. What if I had not been placed in the back row by mistake? The question settled quietly in my mind and refused to leave. I sat there with my hands folded in my lap, listening to the ceremony continue while my thoughts slowly moved through the memories of the past year. It is a strange feeling when realization begins to arrive not as a loud discovery, but as a quiet pattern forming from many small moments that once seemed harmless. I remembered the first time Daniel told me he and Olivia were planning their wedding. We had been sitting in my kitchen on a Sunday afternoon while rain tapped softly against the windows. He seemed excited and nervous at the same time, explaining how Olivia wanted a ceremony that felt elegant but intimate. I told him that sounded beautiful. I also told him that whatever they needed, I would be happy to help. That is the kind of promise a mother makes without hesitation. In the months that followed, I tried to be supportive in every way I could. I helped research venues around Denver. I spoke with caterers and florists. When Daniel mentioned that Olivia wanted white roses lining the aisle, I contacted 3 different flower shops until I found one that could deliver exactly what she imagined. I remember sending her a message afterward telling her the arrangements had been confirmed. She replied with a short thank you and a small smile emoji. It was polite, nothing more. There were other moments that seemed unusual at the time, but never felt serious enough to question. When the wedding invitations were printed, Olivia told me the seating plan would be handled by the wedding planner because she wanted everything to remain organized. That seemed reasonable. Weddings involve hundreds of details. Still, I noticed that each time I asked about where our family would be seated, Olivia gently changed the subject. Once she laughed and said, "Do not worry, Margaret. Everything is taken care of." I believed her. Perhaps I wanted to believe her. A wedding should not feel like a negotiation between families. It should feel like a celebration where everyone shares the same happiness. The officiant's voice brought my attention back to the present as he invited Daniel and Olivia to begin exchanging their vows. The church grew very quiet. Daniel spoke first. His voice was steady but emotional as he promised loyalty, patience, and support. Many guests smiled warmly while listening. A few people dabbed their eyes with tissues. When Olivia spoke her vows, she looked directly into Daniel's eyes with a calm confidence that filled the room. The words were beautiful and carefully chosen. Anyone listening would have believed this was the beginning of a perfect partnership. Yet even as the applause followed their vows, my attention drifted again to the front rows. Olivia's parents sat proudly together, holding hands as they watched their daughter. Several relatives leaned forward smiling at them, clearly recognizing their role in the celebration. I waited quietly, half expecting that at some point the officiant or the planner might acknowledge the groom's side of the family. Instead, the ceremony continued without any mention of us. I felt someone shift into the empty seat beside me. When I turned slightly, I saw a tall man adjusting his jacket as he sat down. It took me a moment to recognize him. It was Robert Dawson, Daniel's uncle, my late husband's older brother. Robert had flown in from Arizona the night before, and I had not seen him since he arrived. He glanced toward the altar for a moment and then looked at me with a puzzled expression. His eyebrows lifted slightly as he leaned closer and spoke in a quiet voice. "Margaret," he whispered, "why are you sitting back here?" I managed a small smile and kept my voice calm. "It is probably just a seating mix-up," I said gently. "These things happen at weddings." Robert looked toward the front rows and then back at me again. His expression did not change, but I could see the confusion clearly in his eyes. He leaned back in his seat and folded his hands, watching the ceremony continue. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he quietly said something that made the quiet thought growing in my mind suddenly feel much heavier. "Strange," he murmured, "because I asked the planner earlier where the groom's family should sit." He paused for a moment before finishing the sentence. "And she told me the seating arrangement was exactly the way the bride requested." Robert's words settled in the quiet space between us, and for a moment neither of us spoke again. I kept my eyes forward, watching Daniel and Olivia as the officiant pronounced them husband and wife, and the church filled with warm applause. Everyone around us stood to their feet, smiling and celebrating the moment. I stood as well, clapping politely like everyone else, but inside my mind something had shifted. The small, uneasy feeling that had followed me through the ceremony was no longer uncertain. It had weight now. It had intention. If the seating arrangement had been done exactly the way Olivia requested, then the empty space between me and the front row had not been an accident at all. It had been a decision. I remained calm as the guests began filing out of the pews to move toward the reception hall next door. Robert walked beside me down the aisle while people chatted excitedly around us. The mood in the church was cheerful and light, the way weddings usually feel once the ceremony is finished. Guests laughed, complimented the decorations, and congratulated the families as they passed. Yet several people paused briefly when they noticed me walking near the back of the crowd instead of at the front where the groom's mother usually stands. Their expressions were not cruel, but they were curious. One woman even tilted her head slightly, as if she was trying to understand something that did not quite make sense. Robert leaned closer to me as we stepped outside into the bright Colorado sunlight. The air was warm and clear, and the reception venue stood only a short walk across the garden path. "Margaret," he said quietly, "did Olivia really arrange the seating chart herself?" I nodded slowly. "Apparently she did," I replied. Robert exhaled through his nose, looking back toward the church doors where guests continued pouring out into the courtyard. "That does not sit right with me," he murmured. I gave him a gentle smile, because I did not want to create a scene on a day that was supposed to belong to Daniel. "It is his wedding day," I said softly. "Perhaps she simply wanted things organized her own way." Robert studied my face for a moment as if he was trying to read something deeper behind my calm expression. Then he nodded once and allowed the conversation to end. We walked toward the reception hall together with the rest of the guests. The venue was a large ballroom attached to the church property, decorated with soft white lights and long tables covered in ivory cloth. The scent of fresh flowers filled the room, and servers were already placing trays of sparkling water and lemonade near the entrance for guests to enjoy. I recognized the arrangements immediately. The white roses lining the tables were the same ones I had helped Olivia choose months earlier. Seeing them now made me pause for a brief moment, remembering the afternoon I had spent on the phone confirming that delivery with the florist. At the time, I had imagined sitting proudly near the front of the reception beside Daniel while we welcomed our family and friends together. Instead, I quietly followed the flow of guests toward the seating chart displayed near the entrance of the ballroom. A large framed board listed every table and every guest name in elegant script. People gathered around it in small groups, laughing and pointing as they searched for their assignments. I waited patiently for the crowd to thin before stepping closer. My eyes moved down the list until I found my name. Margaret Dawson. Table 17. I looked toward the center of the ballroom, where the head table stood beneath a soft arch of flowers. Daniel and Olivia would be seated there along with their closest relatives. Olivia's parents were assigned to table 2, only a few feet away from the couple. Daniel's groomsmen filled the next several tables. Table 17 sat near the far corner of the room beside the service doors where the staff moved in and out carrying trays. Robert stepped beside me and followed my gaze across the room. For several seconds he said nothing. Then he quietly asked the question that had already begun forming in my own mind. "Margaret," he said carefully, "did you know the reception seating was arranged this way too?" Robert's question lingered in the air for a moment while I continued staring at the elegant board listing the reception tables. The room around us buzzed with cheerful conversation as guests located their names and laughed with one another, but for me the sound seemed strangely distant. Table 17. I read the number again slowly, letting the reality settle in my mind. The corner of the room near the service doors was not a place where close family members usually sat. It was the sort of place reserved for distant acquaintances or guests who had little connection to the couple. I took a slow breath and answered Robert honestly. "No," I said quietly. "I did not know." Robert folded his arms as he studied the seating chart again, his eyes moving from my name to the tables arranged near the center of the ballroom. "That does not make much sense," he murmured. "You are Daniel's mother." I gave a small nod, but did not respond immediately. Something inside me had begun to grow very calm. It was not anger. It was not embarrassment. It was a quiet clarity that sometimes arrives when confusion finally disappears. For most of the morning, I had been trying to convince myself that everything I noticed was simply a misunderstanding. But standing there in front of that seating chart made it impossible to continue believing that explanation. The front rows of the ceremony had been arranged intentionally, and now the reception seating confirmed the same pattern. Olivia's family near the center, Daniel's closest friends surrounding them, and me placed quietly in the far corner where I would not be seen. Robert glanced toward the ballroom where guests were beginning to take their seats. "Margaret," he said carefully, "do you want me to say something to Daniel?" I shook my head gently. "No," I replied. "Today is supposed to be his day." Robert looked as though he wanted to argue, but instead he sighed softly and placed a reassuring hand on my shoulder. "If you need anything," he said, "I am here." I thanked him with a small smile and began walking toward table 17. The corner of the ballroom was quieter than the rest of the room. From there I could see the entire reception space clearly. The head table stood beneath a soft arch of white roses while staff members moved around the room adjusting place settings and lighting candles on each table. A small stage had been set up near the dance floor where speeches would be given later in the evening. I took my seat and folded my hands on the table, observing the details around me with a calm focus that surprised even me. Two couples joined the table shortly afterward. They greeted me politely, introducing themselves as distant co-workers of Daniel whom I had never met before. They seemed friendly and talkative, discussing travel plans and work schedules while waiting for the newly married couple to arrive. None of them realized that the woman sitting beside them was the groom's mother. I listened politely and smiled when appropriate, but my attention drifted across the ballroom toward the front of the room. Olivia's parents were already seated near the head table, speaking proudly with several guests who congratulated them on the beautiful wedding. Cameras flashed as the photographer captured candid pictures of the families celebrating together. For a brief moment, I imagined how the scene must appear to everyone else in the room. To them, it likely looked as though the bride's family had organized everything perfectly, while the groom's family remained somewhere out of sight. I noticed a young member of the venue staff approaching the head table carrying a clipboard and a small folder. He spoke briefly with the wedding planner and then glanced across the room as if searching for someone. His eyes passed over several tables before finally settling in my direction. He hesitated for a moment, clearly uncertain, and then began walking slowly toward table 17. I watched him approach with quiet curiosity, unaware that the next few minutes would reveal something that Olivia had never expected me to discover. The young staff member stopped beside our table and gave me a polite, slightly uncertain smile, as if he was not entirely sure he had approached the right person. Up close, he looked to be no older than 25, dressed neatly in the black vest and white shirt that the venue staff wore throughout the ballroom. In one hand, he carried a slim folder, and in the other a clipboard with several papers attached. For a moment, he glanced at the other guests sitting beside me, then back at the name card in front of my plate. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said quietly, leaning slightly closer so he would not interrupt the conversations around us. "Are you Margaret Dawson?" I nodded gently. "Yes, I am." The young man visibly relaxed as if he had been searching for me for some time. "Thank you," he said with a small breath of relief. "I was hoping I would find you before the reception formally begins." The two couples sitting at the table paused their conversation and glanced between us with mild curiosity. I kept my expression calm. "Is something wrong?" I asked. "Not wrong exactly," he replied carefully. "It is simply that there is a document here that requires your authorization before the final service schedule begins." He opened the folder and revealed a printed sheet with several signatures already written neatly at the bottom. For a brief moment, I did not fully understand what I was looking at. Then I noticed the name of the venue printed clearly across the top of the page along with the full event description. Daniel Dawson and Olivia Parker Wedding Reception. My eyes moved slowly down the page until they reached the section labeled Final Payment Authorization. And beneath that heading was my name. Margaret Dawson. The realization came quietly, but unmistakably. Months earlier, when Daniel and Olivia had been finalizing the venue reservation, the manager had explained that the last payment confirmation would need to be approved by the individual whose account had secured the booking. At the time, Daniel had thanked me for helping them handle the deposit because the venue required immediate confirmation to hold the date. I had agreed without hesitation. It had seemed like such a simple thing then. Now the same agreement sat printed on the paper in front of me. The young staff member noticed my attention on the document and continued speaking in a professional tone. "The venue manager asked me to bring this directly to you," he explained. "The reception service cannot begin until the final authorization is confirmed. Normally, we would complete this step earlier, but the wedding schedule moved quickly after the ceremony, and we wanted to be certain we had your approval before the dinner service starts." I studied the paper for another quiet moment while the sounds of the ballroom continued around us. Guests were beginning to take their seats. Laughter drifted from the center tables where friends greeted one another. At the head table, the wedding planner adjusted several place settings while the photographer prepared for the couple's entrance. Everything in the room appeared perfectly organized. Everything except for the quiet detail that now rested in my hands. The young man held out a pen politely. "Whenever you are ready, ma'am," he said. I accepted the pen and glanced across the ballroom toward the front tables. Olivia stood near the entrance, speaking animatedly with several bridesmaids while her parents smiled proudly beside her. Daniel had not yet entered the room. I realized in that moment that Olivia had arranged every visible detail of this celebration with great care. The seating chart, the ceremony order, the reception layout. She had positioned every person exactly where she wanted them. Everyone except the one person who still held the authority to approve the final step that would allow the evening to begin. I lowered my eyes back to the document, the pen resting lightly between my fingers, and for the first time that entire day, I felt something shift quietly in my favor. The pen felt surprisingly light in my hand as I held it above the document. Around me, the reception hall continued filling with cheerful energy. Glasses clinked softly as servers arranged beverages along the tables, and gentle music drifted through the speakers while guests settled into their seats. Everything looked exactly the way a wedding reception should look. Warm, celebratory, perfectly organized. Yet sitting there with the authorization paper resting in front of me, I suddenly understood something that Olivia clearly had not considered when she designed every detail of this day. Control is a strange thing. It can feel absolute when someone is arranging flowers and seating charts and guest lists. But real control does not always sit at the center of the room where everyone can see it. Sometimes it rests quietly in a place no one expects. The young staff member waited politely beside the table, his expression patient but attentive. He was simply doing his job, unaware of the complicated family story that had unfolded throughout the day. The couple sitting near me had returned to their conversation, though I could sense their curiosity about the paper in front of me. I lowered my eyes to the document again and read the final lines carefully. Final authorization required to begin dinner service and reception program. I thought back to the months of planning that had led to this moment. I remember Daniel calling me one evening, sounding slightly overwhelmed while explaining that the venue required a deposit much sooner than they expected. I remembered telling him not to worry about it because I wanted to help. He had sounded grateful. He had even laughed softly and said, "Mom, you always know how to save the day." At the time, I had believed that helping them was simply part of celebrating his new chapter in life. I never imagined that I would one day be sitting in the far corner of the very reception I helped make possible. My eyes lifted again and moved slowly across the ballroom. At the front of the room, Olivia stood near the head table speaking with the wedding planner. Her posture was confident and relaxed, the posture of someone who believed the evening was unfolding exactly as she intended. Her parents stood nearby greeting guests warmly while the photographer captured smiling pictures of the moment. I wondered if Olivia had ever paused to consider how the groom's mother might feel sitting quietly beside the service doors while the rest of the family celebrated at the center of the room. Perhaps she had considered it. Perhaps that had been the entire point. The thought did not make me angry, the way I once might have expected. Instead, it gave me a strange sense of clarity. For most of the day, I had tried to protect Daniel from discomfort. I had remained silent in the back row of the church. I had smiled politely when I saw the reception seating chart. I had accepted my place in the corner of the ballroom without protest because I believed that maintaining peace would allow the celebration to continue smoothly. But now the quiet authority resting in my hands reminded me that silence and dignity are not the same thing. The young staff member gently cleared his throat. "Whenever you are ready, ma'am," he said kindly. I looked down at the pen again and allowed myself a small, thoughtful pause before speaking. "May I ask something first?" I said calmly. "Of course," he replied. "If this authorization is not completed right away, what happens to the reception schedule?" The young man hesitated slightly, choosing his words carefully. "Without final confirmation," he explained, "the catering service and program events cannot officially begin. The venue requires that authorization before dinner service, speeches, and music start." I nodded slowly, absorbing the answer while the sounds of the reception continued building around us. Guests were now fully seated, and a quiet expectation filled the room as everyone waited for the newly married couple to make their grand entrance. I held the pen gently between my fingers, glanced once more toward the center of the ballroom, where Olivia stood smiling confidently, and then returned my attention to the paper resting on the table in front of me. I held the pen for several quiet seconds while the young staff member waited beside the table and the rest of the ballroom slowly filled with anticipation. The music softened and guests adjusted their chairs, turning their attention toward the entrance where the newly married couple would soon appear. From the corner of the room, I could see everything clearly. Olivia stood near the doorway with the wedding planner, her posture relaxed and confident, her smile bright as she spoke to the photographer preparing for the couple's grand entrance. Her parents stood nearby greeting guests warmly, surrounded by laughter and congratulations. The center of the room belonged entirely to them. For most of the day, I had believed that the best thing I could do was remain quiet. I had told myself that creating tension would only overshadow Daniel's happiness. But sitting there with the final authorization document in front of me made one truth impossible to ignore. Silence had not protected my dignity. It had only allowed someone else to quietly erase it. I lowered the pen and looked at the young staff member kindly. "Thank you for bringing this to me," I said calmly. "Would you mind giving me a moment?" He nodded immediately. "Of course, ma'am." He stepped back a respectful distance while I folded the document and stood from my chair. The movement caught the attention of several guests nearby, including Robert, who sat a few tables away. He watched me carefully, but did not interrupt. I walked slowly across the ballroom floor toward the head table. The room was lively but not yet loud, so my movement through the space did not attract much attention at first. Guests were still talking among themselves, sipping drinks, and waiting for the couple to enter. When I reached the center of the room, the wedding planner noticed me and gave a polite but slightly confused smile. Olivia turned at the same moment. For a brief second, our eyes met again, just as they had earlier in the church. Her smile remained in place, but I could see a flicker of uncertainty in her expression when she noticed the folded document in my hand. I stopped a few feet away from her and spoke in a calm voice that carried just far enough for the planner and Olivia's parents to hear. "Olivia," I said gently, "I believe this belongs to you." I handed the paper to the planner, who opened it quickly. Her eyes moved across the page and then lifted toward me with a startled look. "Mrs. Dawson," she said quietly, "this requires your signature." I nodded once. "I understand," I replied. "But I also understand something else now." The small group standing near us grew silent. I did not raise my voice. I did not accuse anyone. I simply spoke with the same steady tone I had used all day. "A wedding should welcome both families," I continued softly, "not hide one of them in the back row in the corner of the room." Olivia's expression tightened slightly as several nearby guests turned their attention toward us, sensing that something important had just been said. I looked toward the ballroom where people had begun to notice the quiet pause in the celebration. Then I returned my attention to the planner. "Please let the venue manager know that I will not be signing the authorization tonight," I said calmly. "The reception can continue if the couple chooses to complete the payment themselves." For several seconds no one spoke. The planner looked down at the paper again, as if hoping she had misunderstood. Olivia's confident smile had completely disappeared now. In its place was a pale silence that said more than words ever could. I gave a small nod to the planner, turned gently, and began walking back toward the entrance of the ballroom. Behind me the music had stopped and quiet whispers moved through the crowd as people tried to understand what had just happened. Robert stood as I passed him, his eyes wide with surprise, but I simply gave him a small reassuring smile. When I stepped outside into the evening air, the warm sunlight had begun fading behind the mountains, and the garden path leading away from the reception hall looked peaceful and still. For the first time that entire day, I felt something lift from my chest. I had arrived that morning expecting to celebrate my son's wedding. Instead, I had discovered something far more important. Respect cannot be requested politely from the back row. Sometimes it must be reclaimed quietly by the person who was never meant to lose it in the first place.